First, I just want to let everyone know that next week we will have available for you the potential examination questions. Okay, so be sure that next week to pick up the potential examination questions. There'll be about 9 or 10 questions, I'm not sure exactly how many on the list, and then from those some of the questions for the exam will be based. And this will become clearer to you later once you see these questions and you can ask your TF about it. But be sure that you pick up those potential questions. Second thing is remind you that next week, next Thursday, your third paper is due. And there's some more copies of the paper topics on the back table. So if you haven't gotten that yet, be sure to pick it up. And finally, just next week, we'll be doing the course evaluations in the section meeting itself. If anyone has any questions for me, you can see me at the back of the room at the end of lecture.
Our topic today is cultural implications of the rise of East Asia. This broad topic provides an opportunity for me to try to link what we've been talking about concerning some of the salient features of Confucian ethics to our contemporary world. Michael Calton, toward the end of his translation and commentary on the 10 diagrams of sage learning, makes a very interesting observation. He argues that Confucianism, as a kind of institutionalized ideology, which of course was reflected in the examination system, in the recruitment of major scholar officials, in terms of the political ideology, a mechanism of social control, featured very prominently in East Asian culture as a whole. In other words, this is the area that we really haven't got into. If you took a Rice Paddy's course, the course on China, tradition and modern transformation, or any courses on Chinese culture, you would be exposed to that kind of analysis, but it's not our concern. In other words, one kind of Confucianism which is considered as institutionalized ideology from Calton's point of view was very, very important in shaping the political culture of East Asia prior to the impact of the West of the 19th century. In other words, East Asian political culture, bureaucratic culture, patterns of upward social mobility, the basic precepts of elementary, secondary, and advanced learning were all somewhat shaped by Confucian ideas. But these ideas were used deliberately by the ruling minority as well as the cultural elite as a form of mechanism of control. The importance of filial piety, of loyalty, of the group versus the individual, of harmony against conflict. All these were used by the political regime to maintain a status quo. But he also argues that Confucianism is a way of life. As a way of life, people like Twege, who is the original author of the 10 diagrams, and his associates, put a great deal of emphasis on the learning of the heart and mind. Learning for the sake of the self, learning to become sages, or learning to become profound persons. This Confucianism, this kind of Confucianism as a way of life, from Calton's point of view, was only practiced by a small minority, the great thinkers, the major scholars, those who had the leisure, the time, and of course the willingness to do it. In other words, you have Confucianism as an institutionalized ideology, a kind of political ideology, as a mechanism of control, which was very widely spread in East Asian political culture. And you have Confucianism as a way of life practiced only by a small minority of those like-minded people. But I think the distinction that he made between Confucianism as an institutional ideology and Confucianism as a way of life is a correct distinction. But his assessment that the learning of the heart and mind was only practiced by a very small minority, I think historically is very difficult to defend. My own sense, my interpretation is that the kind of Confucian learning that is being studied here in this course, in fact, was the mainstream of Confucian thinking in the Neo-Confucian period, probably originated in the classical Confucian period as well. In other words, this is the habits of the heart of the East Asian people. What we've been studying here about the Confucian ideas may be philosophically complicated, intellectually challenging. But some of the major precepts we've been studying here turn out to be very widely accepted by virtually all the major thinkers as well as minor teachers in East Asia. You can actually talk about Confucianism as a way of life of the East Asian people prior to the impact of the West. It is in this sense that the rise of East Asia, ever since the Second World War, as the most dynamic area of socio-economic development, also signaled the revival of the Confucian mode of thinking. In fact, all East Asian societies today have been very deeply under the influence of the Confucian habits of the heart. It is in this sense the kind of modernity, which will be the topic of Thursday, the kind of modernity that East Asian societies exhibit, meaning Japanese, Korean, Chinese communities, including now the People's Republic of China. This kind of modernity is, from the ethical point of view, very much shaped by Confucian ideas we've been studying here now. Therefore, we see a different kind of economic ethics, economic culture emerging in East Asia. Different kind of democratic polity. A different kind of cultural presuppositions, and even a different kind of social organizations. So we are really talking about a different form of modernity. It is quite obvious to most of us that in the last 50 years or so, we see the emergence of what may be called a global village, whether as an imagined community or as a virtual reality. For quite a while, scholars in the West assume that the emergence of a global village or emergence of a global community is the result of Westernization, primarily understood as the only form of modernization. In other words, modernization is Westernization to the core. It is in this sense, many people who are involved in the study of the modernizing process assume it's not that important for us to study other cultures, not important to study cultural diversity, because the modernizing process is going to Westernize the rest of the world. And this is still very deeply rooted in the consciousness of many social scientists and humanists in North America, in Western Europe. But this assumption that modernization is Westernization, and Westernization is going to transform the rest of the world to be functional equivalents of some types of Western consciousness, has been deeply challenged in the last 20 years. Challenged by new trends of thought and institutions, problems, issues emerged in North America, in the United States in particular, but also in Europe. The assumption that Westernization eventually is going to engulf the world, and it's a kind of homogenization in the sense that many different cultural differences will be ironed out. English will be spoken all over the world, and different kinds of societies will eventually become shaped by the American way of life. That confidence in the universalizability of the Westernization has been seriously shaken because of new trends of thought right here in the United States. These new trends can broadly understood as the powerful search for roots in highly industrialized societies, not just in developing countries. What does it mean by search for roots? It means that many of the what we call primordial ties that originally we assume that would be overwhelmed by the modernizing process resurfaced as very important features of our society. In the United States, one of those primordial ties that turns out to be particularly powerful is ethnicity. In the 60s, in the 1960s, most of the American scholars of modernization assume the American way of life as a melting pot is eventually, assimilation model eventually would transform the world. In other words, the modernizing process as a melting pot is eventually going to westernize the rest of the world. And most of the people, if they cannot fully understand our point of view, will be persuaded it's an aspiration. So our present often is the future of people all over the world. So the American dream, in a sense, is totally exportable. Everybody really wants to be an American. That was the belief of the 60s. But in the 70s, many of the scholars who argue forcefully for the melting pot idea believe that ethnicity turned out to be one of the major issues the United States, socially, politically, economically, will have to deal with. And of course, Canada, Belgium, and a number of other societies came to the realization ethnicity may not have been the most serious problem for them to deal with, but language turns out to, another primordial tie turns out to be extremely important, especially in Canada, but also in Belgium. Give you just one example, one of the great universities in the world was University of Louvain in Belgium. But Louvain originally was French-speaking. Because of Flemish nationalism, Louvain eventually was split into two totally different universities. University of Louvain, which is French-speaking, and University of Louvain, which is Flemish-speaking. And of course, if you take into the question of religious fundamentalism, take into the question of territoriality, take into the question of land, also the question of gender. These primordial ties, the search for roots, present a most powerful challenge to the belief that the world is going to be transformed based upon some cherished Western ideas. In the 80s, people then began to realize we really have to recognize cultural diversity as an integral part of our way of life. We, in fact, should try to celebrate cultural diversity. But at the same time, there's a critical concern: if we celebrate cultural diversity, how are we going to maintain ourselves as a unified nation? How can we resist the temptation of relativism, especially pernicious relativism? Means there are no shareable values. There are no common concerns. People organized according to different ethnic groups, different linguistic groups, different religious groups. And of course, the gender question not to mention localism, no society is going to endure. Even the idea of a unified country is in trouble. That's the reason some brilliant minds in the United States begin to worry about the disuniting forces in the United States. One way out of the picture, from an ethical point of view, there are all kinds of other possibilities, is to take a minimum requirement and to underscore the importance of abstract universalism. For example, the importance of rationality. The only way that we can persuade people of many different backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, to come to the conversation, to come to a common conversation, to sit at the same table for discussion, is to present a minimum requirement. The minimum requirement is an abstract rationality, our willingness to talk, our willingness to recognize that we are all basically reasonable, rational human beings. This is minimalist position. And it is in this sense, it's very important for us to push the ethnic problems or ethnic discussions, the gender discussions, the discussions of different linguistic, bilingual education, for example, or the question of religious fundamentalism out of the political arena. We don't want to be bothered by these questions because we hope that there's something which is shared by everyone. We don't want to be divided by all these forces. We want to come to the minimum requirement of a reasonable way of human interaction. And that, of course, basically failed. There's no way you can come up with a simple minimum requirement, because even though it's self-evidently true, it's not inspiring, it's not compelling, it is not persuasive. And it is important for us to deal with concrete issues. I would say lived concreteness. In other words, ethnicity, language, gender, land, faith, and of course class. All these are powerful forces shaping the world and shaping our own society in terms, all these express themselves in the concrete ways that we deal with people and concrete ways of social-political interaction. I think the Confucian tradition has a message in this connection. That is, how can we take our ordinary human existence, very much rooted in a particular situation, constrained by our own ethnicity, language, gender, all these, what I call structural limitations. And yet, as human beings, we can still able to talk across these boundaries and to find commonality, not based upon some abstract universalism or abstract rationality, but based upon other deeply felt human feelings. How is it possible to do that? To be serious about the concrete, at the same time move beyond one's own rootedness. The question of community looms very, very large in this connection. In fact, if we look at the most powerful ideology in the world, I use that advisedly, the most powerful ideology in the world in the last 150 years, the modern West, the ideology of the modern West, informed by the Enlightenment mentality, values like human rights, due process of law, liberty, equality, dignity of the individual, government for, by, and of the people, all these basic Enlightenment values. And if you even look at these three major slogans of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, one area that seems to be oblivious to some of the major thinkers in the West is the question of community. Fraternity, originally a functional equivalent of community, does not feature very prominently in modern Western political thought. the emphasis is always the relationship between the individual and the state, the rights of the individual, the interests of the individual versus the possible dictatorial control of the state, how to negotiate a situation where the privacy, the rights, the interests of the individuals can be protected. Many scholars, political scientists in particular, became aware that in modern Western political thinking, not only community does not feature prominently, some of the most important communities in human experience, such as the family, does not feature prominently at all. You don't talk about the family in political theory. You allowed sociologists and anthropologists to worry about the family. In ethical discourse, in most of the ethical discourse, either Kantian tradition or Lockean tradition or Humean tradition, and it's very much focused upon the question of the individual, the question of the state. Other forms of community are relegated to the background. The key to our rethinking of this issue is to understand the importance of the idea of community or the question of the community in our ethical discourse. How do we understand our way of life as a human being in terms of the significance of the other, in terms of the dyadic relationships between me and those people who are closest to me, my parents, my friends, eventually, my brothers and sisters, of course, my spouse, and so forth. Our spouses. And in this particular line of thinking, my suggestion, if you follow the Confucian mode of thinking, my suggestion is that at a minimum, still at the level of the question of the community, at the minimum is to replace the principle of self-interest, which is a very, very important principle in the modern Western discourse, no matter how broadly defined, with the Confucian Golden Rule, negatively stated. Do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you. And because it is stated in the negative, it has to be augmented by a positive charge. That is, in order to establish myself, I must help others to establish themselves. In order to enlarge myself, I have to help others to enlarge themselves. In other words, the minimum requirement for conversation is not simply to assume that every human being is potentially a rational being, but is to assume that everyone is capable of responding to these two principles. If you cannot do it, at least it has persuasive power that you ought to be able to do it. Do not do to others what you do not want others to do to you. In order to establish ourselves, we must help others to establish themselves. In order to enlarge ourselves, I have to help others to enlarge themselves. Now, these two principles linked to the community, and the community has to be understood in terms of a gradual expansion of human relatedness. And it is possible for us to assume that the community that is particularly close to me may be radically different from the community of my neighbors, of my friends. And yet, each one will recognize the importance, the operational value of these principles, so different kind of communities can be linked into a much larger community. Industrial East Asia, we get a chance to talk a little bit more about that, under the influence of Confucian culture, has already developed a less adversarial, less individualistic, and less self-interested form of modernity. Now, Industrial East Asia, I have with the caveat, Industrial East Asia, since it has been humiliated for a very long period of time by colonialism and imperialism, is now responding to the challenge of the West in terms of the quest for wealth and power with a vengeance. So I'm not suggesting that the form of modernity that is emerging in East Asia under the influence of Confucianism is necessarily a better form. I'm not making that argument at all, because these societies become even more mercantilistic, more competitive, more commercial, more in tune with the modern Western idea of the quest for wealth and power, more under the influence of the Enlightenment mentality. If you want to find defenders of social Darwinian idea of fierce competitiveness, there may not be too many now in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or in Berkeley, California. I mean, theoretical defenders of these ideas, but you find quite a few scholars that are willing to defend this particular mode of thinking in Tokyo, in Taipei, in Hong Kong, in Beijing. So I'm not saying that the rise of industrial East Asia is necessarily suggests a different form of modernity which is more humane. I'm not suggesting that at all. But the kind of modernity under the influence of the Confucian habits of heart seem to be less adversarial, in the sense more with emphasis on collaborations of different kind of groups, and more individualistic, meaning put more emphasis on social relatedness and less self-interest. In other words, the argument for self-interest often is not used. Social well-being in general is used as a more powerful rhetoric. And this suggests it's possible for us to imagine different ethical principles in organizing modern society. So different kind of modernity is emerging. And we need to pay some attention to that kind of modernity. And a course on Confucian ethics is to help us to develop some conceptual apparatuses that would be able to understand our world more critically, and also to imagine the possibility of a world organized very different from ours, based upon also extremely persuasive ethical principles. This is especially important if we look at the global situation. Some scholars now are willing, especially in history, are willing to talk about global history as opposed to simply world history. World history signifies a vision of history of the whole world, almost like a picture of the whole world. You can talk about world history from the Neolithic period and how the human history evolved, not just in one continent, but in many other continents. And gradually, you talk about how the world comes into being as a modern world. So world history is an ecumenical way of looking at the world. But global history, more recently, specifies what actually happened in the last 50 years, the global trends that shape this world in a way totally unprecedented. And with a view to the future, these global trends eventually will be the defining characteristics of world history. So the global trends signal and focused on some of the emerging forces in the world only in the last 50 years or so. And many of these forces can be considered by people in cultural studies crossing boundaries. They force us to think in global terms. We are, of course, rooted in our own environment. Increasingly, we become sensitive to those forces that shape us to be concrete human beings. We're more sensitive to ethnicity, to gender, to language, to our own class, to our own faith. So we're more locally situated. And yet these global trends force us to look beyond our environment and see our connectedness with people who are totally outside of our orbit of consciousness or sensitivity. One powerful global trend in recent years is migration. The movement of human, major migration. If you look at specifically the area we're interested in, East Asia, especially China, migration is a major phenomenon. It's very difficult to imagine the incredible shaping influence of migration in East Asia and in general, and in China in particular. Let's just give you one example. Internal migration in China from the rural areas to the city is now probably more than 120 million. In other words, 120 million Chinese are moving restlessly from one area to the other in China proper. And you have also major migrations of Chinese from Southeast Asia, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, to North America, to Europe, to Australia, to New Zealand. These are major patterns of migration going on. And trade is another area that we need to pay attention to. Now the trade across the Pacific is probably double the trade across the Atlantic for the United States. So in that sense, East Asia is now the most important trading partner for the United States, not just for the state of California, but for the country as a whole. If we take into consideration of information superhighway and the flow of capital, the Taiwan Strait conflicts in the last couple of weeks, and generated billions of capital in California alone, according to one estimate. So it's not simply the capital of the United States and European countries to Asia. Often it's now the other way around, the capital of East Asia to the United States as well. And it is in this sense we have a world that is, people say, shrinking. The world that is being wired, the world that is being interconnected. If you get on the information superhighway, you realize that distance and even time really matters very little. You'll be immediately connected with someone who's in Beijing or in South Africa. But at the same time, your relationship with your neighbor may turn out to be extremely estranged. The sense of distance with your neighbor on the one hand, the sense of no distance whatsoever with someone thousands of miles away become lived reality in our world here and now. Now, in this context, what are the ethical implications? We have one very powerful, to me, totally wrong-headed approach to this situation. This is our colleague Sam Huntington's notion of the clash of civilizations. One ethical implication of all these changes. You're not necessarily familiar with his argument, but it's very popular since 1992, published a short article in Foreign Affairs. Now, Sam Huntington, an eminent political scientist, argues that one of the implications of the shrinking world and global trends is to reassert the basic values in our society. The clash of civilization is to say, in the future, different kinds of cultural values will necessarily be in conflict and tension. And we in the West will have to maintain our own position to be able to truly enhance our commitment to some of the basic Western values. So he very frankly argues the whole clash of civilization thesis is predicated on the West and the rest. The West and the rest. This is his picture of the world. North America and Western European societies, North American societies, United States and Canada, and Western European societies, because share the same democratic culture and share the same primarily Protestant but also Catholic values, should try to consolidate, to establish good relationships with other Christian societies, for example, Latin American societies. These are societies under the influence of Catholicism, increasingly, of course, in modern times, also Protestantism. And also the countries that originally belonged to the former Soviet Union. These are countries under the influence of Eastern Orthodox traditions, still somewhat linked to the Christian world. So you have a major alliance of North America, Western European societies, Latin American countries, and also the former Soviet Union countries, Eastern European countries. For sheer economic expediency, we have to invite Japan to come into this particular arena because the Japanese economic power is too strong to be ignored. Even though Japan is not a Christian country, only about 2% I think the Japanese are, but because of the historical experience of Japan as our junior partner, so we should ally Japan as part of our world, inviting Japan to come. Basically, we don't have to worry about two areas. They have enough problems. One is Africa. They're not going to present any threat to us. Nor do we need to worry too much about India, or South and Southeast Asia, because they do not present, not in the near future, any kind of competitiveness. We need to worry about two areas. The one area is Islamic world, Middle East, and of course in Asia. The largest countries, Islamic countries, are all in Asia. Indonesia, Malaysia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and so forth. But the Middle Eastern countries, many of them, Iran and so forth, because of Islamic fundamentalism, we need to worry about. And then, relevant to our cause, we need to worry about the Confucian countries, primarily China, People's Republic of China, but also Korea, especially North Korea, and to a certain extent, Vietnam. Now, you look at the world in terms of the clash of civilizations. You want to consolidate your own cultural base and ethical foundation, and you make clear who are your friends, who are your enemies. You want to align with the people who will be your friends, and be very careful that your enemies will not form a united front against you. And I think this particular way of looking at the world is totally wrong-headed. The reason it's totally wrong-headed is the conception of the West and the rest is so narrow in terms of what the West is all about, and also so ideologically wrong in considering the rest in an adversarial relationship. Because we have to recognize the fact that so far as ethical religious traditions are concerned, they are like global trends. Migration, trade, information, capital, there are no national boundaries. To try to think about ethical religious issues in terms of geopolitical politics itself is highly problematical. Just look at our own situation. The fastest growing religion in the United States turned out to be Islam. And the United States has always been a country that is hospitable to new ideas, new forces, new challenges. It's not a narrow-minded assimilation model. It's a very broad-minded notion about not only coexistence, cultural pluralism, but social transformation based upon new possibilities, new horizons of understanding. Another thing to be concerned is that the whole conception of globalization on the one hand and localization on the other is wrong. There is globalization of the local, and then also the localization of the global. The term now people use, I give you one or two examples, you'll be able to get it very easily. The people try to use an awkward term, is Global. Try to keep in mind this word. I just learned it over the weekend. So, global meaning both global and local. And it's some of the local ideas on the surface, local knowledge, local ideas become globalized. One kind of local traditions that become totally globalized turn out to be the modern West. We know that. If you look at human history in the last 150 years, one kind of culture, the modern West, has become totally globalized. It's everywhere, not only in North America, in Europe, but certainly in Australia, but in East Asia, in India, in Africa, everywhere. But unfortunately, the globalization of the modern West was based upon wealth and power. It's imperialism, it's colonialism, it's a kind of mentality of domination. So most people, from ethical points of view, rejected that as not a very, ethically speaking, salvific process. It's not congenial to human flourishing, the process of globalization. So we now were thinking about other trends of globalization that may not be related to that earlier experience of imperialism and colonialism. We're in a decolonialized state. We put more emphasis on communication, on networking, on negotiation. We have to accept the fact that the world will be shaped by quite a number of cultural centers, political centers, and economic centers. The possibility of one center that is going to engulf the world is totally outmoded. It's outmoded way of thinking. Shortly after the Second World War, the economy of the United States constituted about 75% of world economy. Europe was in a very terrible shape. But nowadays, it's only 18%, 19%. There are many, many important centers, many different kinds of social, many different local cultures not being internationalized. And if you look around the United States, even in terms of the Boston area, we have a project conducted by a colleague of us, Diana Eck, Religious Pluralism Project. Just look at the religious landscape of Boston area. You'll be amazed how many different kind of religious traditions, ideas there are in shaping our spiritual landscape here and now. Many of the things that consider highly local, highly distant are now very much in our front yard. This is, against this context, especially against the background of the clash of civilization, I think the Confucian way of thinking, or the option, at least suggests an alternative approach. And this alternative approach has 7 features. I'll go through them very briefly. The first feature is the faith in the improvability of the human condition in terms of an inclusive humanism. In other words, if you want to think about a community in Confucian terms, you have to think about the community from even the relationship between 2 persons to the world at large. You have to develop the conceptual resources that you'll be able to think about community as a continuum, rather than a very limited conception of a community simply based upon one type of primordial ties. If you want to focus on ethnicity, that's fine. But you have to also, in understanding your ethnicity, take into consideration of class, of religion, of gender, of language. So in that sense, you have a much more complicated, fluid notion about community. And it is in this sense, I believe it's possible for us to imagine that our ultimate concern is not just for the community very constituted according to primordial ties, but the global community, especially the earth. I think from the Confucian point of view, it's easy for us to argue the case that the sanctity of the earth, the well-being of the earth is relevant to all of us. So in other words, how you're going to understand the question of community to develop based upon the fundamental faith in the improvability of the human condition. The second presupposition, again, can be open to all kinds of argument. It's the person as a central relationships, not as an isolated or even isolatable individual. In the concrete experience, nobody denies that. But in the theoretical argument, for example, the human rights discourse, it's very difficult to imagine group rights. It's always individual rights. But we need to think about many societies that will be able to develop other kind of resources in understanding human rights. Try to think not simply in terms of an isolated individual. Now the third one is another basic conception, which of course it may sound extremely conservative, but I don't think it's conservative, I think it's fundamental. That is, we cannot deny the centrality of family, no matter how it's constituted. I can take a very different view of what is a family. It's negotiable. The family only with adopted children, the family with one parent, the family of two parents of the same sex, the family who is extended with 3 generations, the family only 2 generations. There are numerous ways of looking at a family. But as a social unit, can we afford to begin our ethical discourse without taking into consideration of this particular social unit? I think the Confucians will argue, no, you cannot. You really have to take into consideration. Of course, many families, I think I talked to quite a number of you now, I'm quite aware of the fact, families or parents turn out to be abusive, turn out to be an environment I want to get out of, rather than an environment that I feel that it's going to nourish me. Even if that's the case, it is a reference point we need to talk about. We cannot simply exercise amnesia as if it never happened. Because in the socialization of, even if we are teenagers, the socialization, the power is there, need to be encountered, need to be discussed, need to be analyzed. The fourth one is primary and secondary education. Ought to be a societal commitment, almost like the civil religion. Because education ought to be character building rather than simply the acquisition of certain form of knowledge. The fifth one is that it's not law. Law provides the minimum requirement for social order, but we have to discuss civilized mode of conduct in terms of ritual for human flourishing. It's not possible for any society to survive and to flourish only with the legal constraint. We need to have something more than the legal constraint. Litigiousness turned out to be very detrimental to human flourishing. And 2 last points. The sixth one is that morality is closely linked to political leadership. We cannot simply take the Machiavellian notion of politics in the public arena as something which is so independent, so autonomous, that our private sentiments, our private concerns, our own feelings about morality become totally irrelevant. The morality, in the sense, the conduct of the bureaucrats, the people who are more influential, more powerful, more resources to use to control, are more obligated. They have to be held a higher standard of behavior. Simply, you cannot afford not to take politics as also an important feature of a moral discourse. So finally, we need to develop a holistic vision, a very broad holistic vision. That is the Confucian commitment to self-cultivation, family cohesiveness, social stability, political order, and the world peace is predicated not on an anthropocentric idea that man is the measure of all things, but it's predicated on an anthropocosmic vision. And that vision forces us to seek fruitful relationship not only between ourselves and our community, but between the human species and the environment, meaning the globe, nature, and also possibly the relationship, fruitful relationship between our human heart and mind on the one hand, and the weight of heaven on the other.